I ended up reconnecting with my neighbors that had taken me to church when I was young, and their new pastors were over for dinner. And they invited me for dinner, and they had no idea that this was going on. And so I'm sitting on the couch looking incredibly distraught because every waking moment of my day was thinking about the church.
Yes.
And so I'm sitting there, and they caught me like zoning off or doing something. They're like, Taylor, like, what is wrong? Nothing. I'm not going to tell you, it's all good. And they're like, no, just talk to us. Like, we're here for you. We love you, whatever. I'm like, well, I think I might have to become Catholic. And I'm pretty sure they looked at me like I had like 5 heads. They're like, what? And I had like cried about this to my friend earlier in the day. She knew it was coming, and her parents were like, why would you ever like think that you have to become Catholic? They believe in here we go. And so, like I said, their new pastors that they had just started going to their church, they were there. And so this is their first impression of me. It's like me having my Catholic crisis is what we lovingly call it.
Listen, guys, those of us who move from like a charismatic Christianity into the Catholic Church begin to realize, like my guest Taylor does this week, the things that we were missing, the shadows, the shades of things that are just fulfilled in a liturgy, in a faith life, in a sacramental way of doing Christianity that has existed for 2,000 years in the Catholic Church. That we had shades or shadows of those things in our non-denominational, charismatic, evangelical churches, right? An altar call week after week, right? Replaced by an actual altar, right? The calls to recommit to Christ week after week, to ask for forgiveness, replaced by sacramental confession, a once, twice a year, or once a month communion, a symbolic communion, replaced by a real presence of Christ in the Eucharist week after week as the centrality, the central thing. That worship music, praise music, the important, great, but replaced by actual worship, actual sacrifice in the Mass, in the Eucharist, week after week. My guest this week, Taylor, does a fantastic job of putting a strong, solid, very exacting point on all of these things, these experiences as an evangelical that are not just deepened, fulfilled in a very real sense in the Catholic Church, and why she and so many others of us become Catholic to begin with. Guys, it's a great conversation. Please watch and enjoy. This week, I'm joined by Taylor. She is a Catholic convert from evangelicalism who's involved in various aspects of ministry and is before she came home to the Catholic Church. She began sharing her faith journey online and found an unexpected community along the way. It's been fantastic stuff. Since being received into the church, she has continued to share her story and reflections on social media with a desire to share the beauty and the truth of the Catholic faith. Taylor, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show, and hello.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you. Listen, I feel like if this were, like, and I'm going to date myself here, if this were 10 years ago and I found your content on social media, you'd be like the number one influencer, number one digital missionary, number one person that I'd be paying attention to, because I love your stuff on Instagram. It's approachable, it's friendly, it's got this like often dry kind of humor that I love, and it's wonderful. I mean, and so much of what has attracted me to your videos and to your work is you're just like explaining the plain sense of like the Catholic truth and dispelling like misunderstandings that are like really obvious in like just a very like straightforward, disarming way. And one thing I've learned doing this show and in my journey too, and probably in yours too, it is just unpacking those misconceptions that you realize what you thought you knew about the Catholic Church was completely bonkers, and like here's the real stuff, and you go, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So I gotta say kudos, because your content just does that so well. I love it. So thank you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm I really appreciate that. That's kind of the goal. I'm sure I'll get more into that later, but yeah, that was the kind of goal for me, is to be what I needed back when I was first investigating the church. And it's a fun time. So I enjoy it a lot.
It's fantastic. And a good level of cat content too, which I always appreciate.
Yes. I love my cats.
That's amazing. It's good stuff. Listen, so my job here for our conversation, for the most part, is me just kind of get it out of the way, because you're a convert to the Catholic faith. I know nothing of your story, which always is fun to kind of unpack it on the fly, so I can also be surprised along with listeners and viewers. So what we'll do is I'll get out of the way. I'll let you go back as far as you want to go back, like to the, you can go back to the day when you were born if you want to. However far back makes sense. Unpack your faith journey, where did it begin, and then how do we get to here? We'd love to hear it. So Taylor, where does it begin? Where does your faith journey begin for you?
Yeah, so definitely going to go back just to give some context. My parents were not religious growing up. I was told that we went to a Baptist church when I was younger, but the story is that my brother kept escaping the daycare and they kept finding him in the hallway, which is like very on brand for my little brother. So I think that's really funny. So we just stopped going to church. Like, I feel like we went because that was the thing 25-ish years ago. But we just kind of stopped altogether. And so we just didn't go to church. I didn't grow up in the church. I would go to like vacation Bible school with friends, or my grandparents might take me somewhere. And I always loved going, like even as a 10-year-old, preteen, whatever, I loved going to church. And my parents were so annoyed that I was always asking to go to church. And I think that's just like a testament, like now looking back, that like God was always after my heart. And I was always drawn to something more. So I was going to church whenever I could, however I could. I would go when I was at my grandparents' house. I would walk to the church across the street and just go by myself. I made all these friends. I'm still, in contact with them. That was just who I was, which is really funny because I'm super like nervous and shy and introverted, but for some reason I really wanted to be in church.
Yeah.
And so I went and I prayed the salvation prayer, dozens of times back then, because I would go to church and then I wouldn't go back to church for a long time. And so I've been saved hundreds of times. But later on, as far as like me going consistently, my parents got divorced when I was 10, and my mom had moved into this house, and we had these neighbors who had a daughter that was around the same age as me. And her and I became really good friends. We were in school together, hanging out all the time, and her family went to church twice a week. And so they started inviting me along. I was in the youth group, as you know, 6th, 7th, 8th grader. I was a musician, so I could play by ear. I could play the piano by ear, and I could read music. But I wanted to join the worship team so bad that I taught myself how to play piano chords so I could join the youth worship team on Wednesday nights. And that was really fun. I loved it. I found community there. I found really close-knit family there, which is not something that I had in my personal life. Yeah. And so I think that I just became another member of my friend's family. Like, they called me their third daughter. And, I went to church with them whenever I could. And that was great. And then towards high school, that friend ended up being homeschooled, so I just wasn't seeing her as much. And then I got involved in other activities to where I just wasn't able to go to church consistently. And so I kind of just stopped going. I got involved in some, typical, I guess, high school things that I'm not super proud of. And then towards the end of my senior year of high school, I was kind of deciding what I was going to do. And so my stepsister ended up passing away in a car accident.
Wow.
Yeah. And through that, it was in the snow, and it was just a one-car accident. But it really bothered me in the way that I was nervous to drive. It just, I was scared. And so I ended up turning on K-Love while I was driving. And for some reason, it just brought me a lot of peace. And so that was kind of the moment for me that was I have to get back into this.
Yeah.
Especially like seeing and hearing how my stepsister like lived her life. Her and I were not super close, but just like hearing about how much she loved the Lord and like wanted to serve him and different things there. I had known her, for so many years before, she actually became my stepsister. We used to go to church together. And so just like her life and like people saying that they had the confidence that like they knew where she was, which, we could debate theology on that, of course. But that is what I was like, okay,
Yeah.
if I'm going off to school, then I need to get involved. And so I went to college and I looked up campus ministries and I was like, I know if I don't find community, then I'm not going to stick with it, because that was always something that I needed. And so I got involved with a campus ministry. It was called Chi Alpha. And it's an Assemblies of God ministry. I joined the worship team there. I was, in a small group. I was doing all the things. I lived in their ministry house that they had on campus at one point.
Yeah.
So I was in this community all the time, constantly, constantly around people. And then I dropped out of school. And so then, when you're not in college, you can't be a part of a college ministry. So I moved home. I went to other churches. I pretty much always joined whatever worship team I was there. That was always a really important thing to me, connecting with other people. I loved it. And so at this time, I had left school. I was involved with a church, and then I ended up moving home. And I was working as a nanny, just kind of while I figured out like my next steps. And I had moved home, so I knew I was going to have to find a new church. And so I was kind of in between places. And while I was nannying, I ended up house sitting for the family. And they were Catholic, which is not super important to the story, but I find it ironic now. I was laying there one night and I was scrolling on YouTube, like as you do when you're not trying to sleep. And I come across a video from Lizzie's Answers, if you're familiar with her.
Yeah.
And I had followed her for another reason, not for her like religious content necessarily, but she posted a video called Why I'm Becoming Catholic.
Yes, yeah.
And so this is in 2018. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Why would you do that? And so I clicked on it and I watched it, not knowing that it was going to ruin my life. I do like make the joke that like it ruined my life in the best way. Because it was the first time that I had heard of apostolic succession and the church fathers in the Eucharist. And she was quoting the church fathers about the Eucharist. And I had no idea that like they claimed that it was the early church. And so after watching that video, it's like that moment, I don't know, my heart just like sank. I was like, oh no, am I going to have to become Catholic? Because the only thing that I knew about Catholics is that they worshiped Mary and like never prayed to God and all these things. And of course, that's because the only Catholics in my life were not very devout. And I really didn't know any Catholics. And I was also getting all these misconceptions throughout my life in the Evangelical church. And so after that video, I still had like 4 or 5 days that I was house sitting, and every free moment I was reading and researching and watching videos. And I would type in Catholic view on Eucharist debunked, or like why I can stay a Protestant. I was like looking for anything to grab onto, just because I really didn't want to be Catholic. And during this time, my prayer was, God, please don't make me become Catholic. And so after this point, I had went home after I was house sitting, still like very distraught. Spent the next like 2 months probably investigating into the church, reading all that I could, really trying to not become Catholic. I ended up reconnecting with my neighbors that had taken me to church when I was young, and their new pastors were over for dinner. and they invited me for dinner, and they had no idea that this was going on. And so I'm sitting on the couch looking incredibly distraught because every waking moment of my day was thinking about the church.
Yes, yes.
And so I'm sitting there, and they caught me like zoning off or doing something. They're like, Taylor, like, what is wrong? Nothing. I'm not going to tell you, it's all good. And they're like, no, just talk to us. Like, we're here for you. We love you, whatever. I'm like, well, I think I might have to become Catholic. And I'm pretty sure they looked at me like I had like 5 heads. They're like, what? And I had like cried about this to my friend earlier in the day. She knew it was coming, and her parents were like, why would you ever like think that you have to become Catholic? They believe in here we go. And so, like I said, their new pastors that they had just started going to their church, they were there. And so this is their first impression of me.
Yeah,
is like me having my Catholic crisis is what we lovingly call it. And they're like, why do you think you have to become Catholic? And I was 21, 22 at the time. So like, I don't know. I like feel like I'm inferior to these like pastors who know all these things. And so I'm like, well, like, I don't know. Like, I'm not explaining. I'm like, oh, I believe like John 6 is talking about the Eucharist and apostolic succession and all these things. And so like I brought up a little bit, but they immediately were like debunking what I was thinking. And so leaving that conversation, I was like, okay, I don't have to become Catholic. Like, it's going to be fine. So I think I was just so tormented that I took all the Catholic things that I was learning and just shoved it under the rug. I was like, I'm not going to do this. Like, I don't know any Catholics. I'm not going to do that. And just like completely change my life and my view. And I'm like, well, I'll just go to these people's church. They seem to be pretty good people. So I jumped into this church. I started serving full time. This is still 2018. I'm on the worship team. I'm a young adult leader. I'm in discipleship. I'm cleaning. Anything that I can do, I'm doing it. Those were my people. Those were my family, everything. And I did that for a number of years. Then 2020 hits and COVID hits. And I was a part of a team of 8 to 10 maybe that were doing the live stream services. So I was still going to church and participating in that. And during this time, deconstruction is really popular on TikTok. And I'm coming across things. And I'm seeing just, I don't know, I like critical thinkers, like, yes, some people who are like taking it maybe too far, but also some people that are diving in deeper to just the surface level theology. And so it gets me thinking. And then as things progress with the pandemic, and I was a part of that like smaller group of people, you start to see how things are handled, I guess, with like higher leadership. And it just wasn't something that I loved. And it was unfortunate. Just seeing how they would handle certain things and it, just being dishonest. And it was hard for me. And again, I'm a nobody. I don't have a title in this church. I'm a volunteer who's there, basically full-time or not full-time, part-time hours. But still like I'm a nobody who knows nothing. And so I started seeing these things and I can't say anything about it. And so I just keep going and I'm like, well, maybe it'll get better. And then the election comes up and they had always said, like, we will never get political. That did not happen. It did get political. And it was unfortunate. And I just saw how people were handling things and talking about things. And again, can't say anything. And so this is November, December of 2020. And this is when I'm like really questioning. And I feel like in the back of my brain, the Catholic theology was always there. And any time that I would hear a sermon or anything spoken, I was comparing it to like the Catholic stuff that I had learned. And so I got to the point that at this point, like, I was just disagreeing with what was being spoken. I thought that verses were being taken out of context and just that we were missing what the original writers were intending. And I was like, well, if like, if I feel this, I don't believe that I should be on the platform every week leading these people in worship and, like, sitting here. Not because, like, I don't support it, just like I just don't feel right about it.
Yeah.
And so I was being discipled by my pastor's wife, and I told her, I said, I think you need to take a break. And she basically said, no, that's not a good idea. And I was like, you're right. You're so right. Like, I'm going to figure this out. And I was also like discipling somebody else at this time. So I was being poured into by her, and then I was pouring into like a teenager. And so then I was like really struggling with that because I was supposed to be pouring into this young lady's life. And it was so hard for me to kind of sit there while I'm questioning everything and wondering what I'm supposed to do. And so I made it about another month, and I really tried. I gave it my all. I was doing everything in the church. I was begging God again to not make me Catholic and like to stay, because these were my people. Like, this was my family.
Yeah.
I worked with people at the church. Like, they worked at the same company I did. I was spending all my time with them. They were my people. And so I made it, like I said, about another month, and I came like to the end of myself, and I was like, I can't do it anymore. Like, I can't. I have to figure out what I believe is true, and I can't just like live this dishonest life. And so I sat down with my pastor and his wife, and I told them that I was leaving, and it was the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life. I told them I was taking a break, not that I was leaving. And because I think I was just trying to avoid the questioning. But like deep down, I feel like I knew that I wasn't going to go back, but also I wanted the opportunity to go back if I ever did. So it was a really hard thing. And so I quit everything at that point. So wasn't on the worship team anymore, didn't go to young adults, was out of discipleship, everything. And that was the first time since I was in high school that I was like, I don't want to say free, but I was like not under any sort of like church authority or anything.
Yeah.
And it was crazy because it was the first time that I could like think and research and do whatever I needed to do. So I was really burnt out from that church. Just like I said, I was basically working a part-time job, doing everything I could because I loved it.
Yeah.
But after I left that church, I was like, I just need a break. Like, I just need to sit, not go anywhere, clear my head, get through this. I feel like I was like kind of tearing down things that people, like I was unlearning things. I know people hate the word deconstruction, but really I was like, I needed to get to the foundation because of what I had built my entire life and ministry on. And so this was at the beginning of 2021 that I had left. By the end of 2021, I kind of was like, okay, I'm like feeling ready to try church again. And I went to mass for the first time. It was a like 5 p.m. mass. This was before I started like reading again. I was like, I just need to like go to mass and see how it is. And it was a 5 p.m. Sunday evening. Someone had like mentioned this church to me months ago, and I looked it up on Google. It was downtown. It's where I go now, in Cincinnati. And I was like, oh, I need to go there. It's beautiful. And so I went. It was scary. I didn't know anybody, but I sat in the back and I just like watched. And it was great because nobody spoke to me, which I know, like, again, like people are going to be like, oh, Catholics need to be more welcoming. We need to make like more connections. But for me in that time, going from a church where everybody knew my name, and like I would have to stay after church because people were coming to talk to me because I was in front of people on a platform. And, I loved that. Like, I loved those people. But what I needed to go to mass when I went to mass is for nobody to speak to me. So I went, and I was so nervous. I was thinking everybody's looking at me, and they're not. They don't care. I sat, had no idea what I was doing. And, had, like I said, heard them read from the Bible, which was really interesting because I was taught that Catholics don't read the Bible. And we prayed to God and talked to Jesus and not to Mary. I mean, she's mentioned a couple times, but nothing like what I expected.
Yeah.
And so I left that and I was like, okay, that was cool. I didn't really get a lot out of it. It was like a really peaceful place. And like I said, a good place for me to just be, and nobody knew who I was. And so a couple months later, I had like just moved. This is probably in 2022, like summer of 2022. And I was like, okay, like let's look at this Catholic thing with like fresh eyes, like a fresh mind, with like no preconceived ideas, because I want to be in church. Like I had left the evangelical church and I was kind of tearing down certain things that I had learned, but I knew that God was real and I knew that he was good. And I knew that I wanted to, continue to follow him into Christianity. And so I started reading things again. And I was telling some people over the weekend that are Catholic content creators that I used to watch their content while I would work from home. I had like my iPad up on my desk, and I had watched like all the big names like Matt Fradd and everybody on Catholic Answers, but they used words that were really big. And so I would just spend my time on YouTube like finding like normal Catholic creators that were super relatable. And this is back, and I joke like I knew you before you were famous, because like I would watch them when they only had a couple hundred subscribers.
Yeah.
And it was just nice to like listen to people talk and like see that they were normal, like they weren't these like super smart apologists, and it was really cool. And so I was like, okay, I had come to the point I was like accepting Catholic theology as true. And I was like, this really might be where I have to go. And so I started going to Mass consistently Advent of 2022. And I had no idea what Advent was. And so I find it fitting that that was my first Sunday, is like, oh my gosh, it's the Church New Year. And I was like, what the heck is Advent? So that was cool. And I was going to Mass. I was researching. I was like getting, like I said, more comfortable. And so my prayer changed from God, don't make me Catholic, to God, if you're going to make me Catholic, you're going to change my entire heart about this. But I'll follow you, I guess. We can do it. And so I was finding a lot more peace. I hadn't really talked to anybody in person about it. And besides my poor friends who do not care. So I was like pretty sure that I was going to do this, but I wasn't sure like how or when or like what I was going to do. And so Ash Wednesday was like the day that I was sure, because I went to my church. My church is beautiful. And I came late because I thought it was at 5:30 and not 5:00. And so by the time I got there, there's like no seats available in the back where I always sit. And so I have to sit in the front. And I had never walked up to the front of the church before, because anytime that there was communion, I never went up for a blessing.
Sure, yeah.
But for ashes, anybody can get ashes. So I went up and I got ashes, and it was the first time that I'd ever walked up to the front of the church, and I like looked up like at Jesus on the crucifix, and I looked up at this like beautiful ceiling in church and the saints and angels, and just it was gorgeous. And like I got ashes and I sat down, I was like, this is where I'm supposed to be. I was like, I need to be in this church. And so the next week I went up to the priest after Mass and I was like, I want to become Catholic, can you help me? And he was like, so excited, like, yes, come to my office this week and like we'll figure it out. And I picked the right priest. We have 3 priests at our parish, but I picked the right one because he ended up being my RCIA teacher, and he did all of my sacraments. And like, he's one of my, like, he's so dear to me, such a good father figure. And so him and I met, and I told him my story, and he basically let me come in once a month until RCA started in September, so all through the summer, and we would sit down and he would say, okay, what questions do you have? and he would just let me talk, and I was not used to that. And it was the best thing for me, who had been like toiling over this for years, because mind you, I started this in 2018 and it's 2023 at this point. It was the best thing ever. And so RCIA starts, I convert into the church. That was a whole thing. I mean, God worked on my heart during this whole time, and it was just really beautiful, and it was something that I never expected. And even like during Lent, as you're like working into, Easter confirmation, there was a point that I was like, yeah, I can't do this actually. Committing to this for the rest of my life is crazy. And I went to my priest, his name is Father Jacob, and I was like, I don't know about this. I mean, obviously I was more upset than that. And he was like, it's going to be okay. Chill out. You have a while. And there's this one moment too, I was in adoration, because I had started going to adoration as well, which was really beautiful. And during my conversion, I had like felt God pretty close. Like once I had made that decision to become Catholic, I felt like he was like pretty close to me. But as soon as like Lent hit, it was like, see ya. Yeah. And I was like, am I making the wrong choice? I don't feel you, God, like, where are you? And I don't hear God audibly often, but I do remember that moment just being like, I've walked with you, this entire time, but just as I was in the desert for 40 days, it's time for you to like walk the rest of the way, and I will meet you at the end. And I was like, okay, I can do this. I think I'm going to try. And he really did like meet me at Holy Week. I was so overjoyed and emotional and like so sure of my decision. And I was confirmed, and it was beautiful and lovely. And so now, ever since then, that was a year ago, 2024, I've just been kind of learning how to live out that life as a Catholic.
Yeah. Hey guys, just a real quick word to say thank you for watching this video. Thanks for enjoying this channel. If you have not yet subscribed to our channel, please do subscribe, hit that bell, get notifications, like this video, leave some comments, guys. We'd love to have you on board so you can watch everything else we're doing on this great channel. If you want to support this show, guys, financially, those links are in the show notes too. It's not my full-time job, so your support of the show goes a long, long way to making this possible. Thanks for watching, and continue please to enjoy this great content. That's a great story. That's a fantastic journey. I love it. There's so much to dig in. I think maybe we'll go backwards first. Maybe I love what you said about this idea, and kudos to this fantastic priest letting you just talk to him, because I get that, right? When you don't know. I mean, I was on a similar journey in that I had no like close Catholic friends who I was like inspired to become Catholic by. I was reading authors, some living, some dead, right? And watching YouTube videos like you did, right? Mm-hmm. With people I never would possibly ever be able to meet at that time, right? So I had no one to talk to about these things. I began blogging because, right, 15 years ago, that was a thing people used to do, is right, it has blogs. And so I was so desperate for dialogue. I was just writing my thoughts out online and hitting send, hoping someone might read it and respond. So I get that urge to talk about like what you're going through, right? And I think like that the whole deconstruction piece there is part of that, right? Because you're taking apart things that you'd believe before about your own faith. You're encountering things in the Catholic faith that you had misconceptions about, that you're dismantling and then rebuilding that and realizing these things fit here. It's like you say, it's a funny word, and sometimes there's a lot of like, oh, that silly deconstruction people, that's ridiculous. But I think it's the right word, right? And I don't know about you, but for me, I was on a bit of a journey with some friends who were quote unquote deconstructing. Where I got was the Catholic Church. Where they got is no faith at all. And it's interesting how that journey can be so similar to a point and then take like a left turn, right? Into like you and I became Catholic on that journey. Others just kind of often abandon their faith in that journey, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an interesting point. I think that while the Catholic Church gave me so many answers that I was searching for, the Catholic Church can't answer everything because it does require faith. And like there are things that are a mystery to us. And so if we had all the answers, there wouldn't require any faith or a knowing or having to trust in a God who is so much bigger and smarter and knows everything than just, we do. And I think that was something that I had to eventually come to terms with too, because I was always seeking more. I'm still seeking more, and I will never reach the end.
Yes.
But that is what I had to kind of just accept, is that I will never know everything and things will not make sense to me. Heck, even the Trinity doesn't make sense to me most of the time. Or like how God meets us in the Eucharist. Like that's such a beautiful thing that I don't understand. And I don't think that we're supposed to be able to comprehend these things. And I think people struggle with that. We want tangible things that we can hold on to and answers. And so I think it comes to a point where people have to decide to trust and believe in God and have that faith or not.
Yeah, and you mentioned like these the idea of mystery, right? There's what I encountered, and again, I'm thinking of friends of mine or people online you see who are deconstructing like their worldviews, is often that worldview, and it was certainly for me as an evangelical, maybe for you too in some aspects, that worldview is a very particular and often very narrow, small kind of worldview. You think that is Christianity, and as you begin tearing that apart, you realize, wait a minute. Like my belief in like the rapture, like a pre-trib rapture idea, right? Is like a very minority view in all of history and even all of present Christianity. It's a really tiny view. This is the world to me because my church believes that, all the authors I read believe that. But you begin to deconstruct and realize that what you were holding on to as what all Christians believe actually is definitely not, right? In many cases. And that's like, that can be a whole other thing, because you see, and then you see these people deconstructing that worldview and leaving Christianity because they think that worldview is everybody. And you're like, no, wait. There's like, but Catholics believe this, and like we do, right? I don't know about you. That was really fascinating for me, that realization, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we also believed in the rapture, and that was like a big thing we talked about every week. Again, I told you I've been saved hundreds of times, and that's because at the end of every church service, we had an altar call, and it's like, if you don't know without a shadow of a doubt that if Jesus Christ were to return right now, he would slam his hand on the desk, like, raise your hand. And I was like, over here, like, I don't know. But yeah, when I started discovering that is such a new idea. And also another thing for me was the fact that I was told that Catholics added books to the Bible.
Right.
Things like that. And then also I think, unfortunately, like American evangelicalism is so politically driven. And I really started having issues with just that idea that I had to fit into a certain box or I wasn't allowed. And now, I don't know, just looking at especially like Catholic social teaching and like different things, I just wish that I had that before, because it has helped make me like make sense of the world, honestly, instead of just focusing so narrow on like how Christianity, to me, what I thought was like this thing that focused on like American evangelicalism. And Christianity is a global religion, and I don't know, I just wish that I would have thought about that before.
Yeah, it's shocking. I had Doug Beaumont on the show a couple of years ago, who's like studied these things in depth and was of course an evangelical like seminary professor, became Catholic. Lots joined him in that kind of movement at a school down south. But he would say like he sees so many of these people who are deconstructing their worldviews, who are leaving Christianity because they think that pre-trib rapture Christianity is what all Christianity is. But like you said, like that's a very American evangelical phenomenon, right? Now
Mhm.
it's exported around the world in different places, of course, right? And I'm in Canada saying this, and we have the same kind of ideas here of these things. But overall, like globally, that's a very, very small percentage of Christian believers believe that. But it seems like this great big thing, right? This American kind of, there's a political kind of thread running through that, right? And there's the rapture kind of thread running through that, and you have to have certain beliefs. It's crazy to realize that there are actual other versions of Christianity that are actually much, much more popular outside of like that small kind of orbit that we're in, right?
Mhm.
And that do different things, right? Like you mentioned, like the Eucharist and like the idea of receiving communion every single week. Like that was so
Yeah.
foreign, right? I don't know about you. I assumed all churches just did communion once a month kind of thing. It was very symbolic, right?
Yeah, we did ours like twice a year at most.
Yes, yes, yes. Which was we thought was normal,
Mhm.
right? So it's shocking to realize that that was actually a very minority way of doing church, right?
Mhm. Yeah. It was weird. One time I was doing like a live stream talking about something, and someone was like, "Oh, how often did you guys pray the Lord's Prayer?" And I was like, "We never prayed the
Yes,
Lord's Prayer.
never.
I didn't
Yes.
even know the Lord's Prayer when I
Yes.
joined the Catholic Church." And I mean, I'm sure, like, similar to any evangelical church, it was like the band played 3 songs, and then there was a sermon, and at the end for us, like I said, there was always an altar call,
Yeah, yeah.
and, like, that was church. And, sometimes we wouldn't even get to a sermon. We were, very charismatic. And so
Yeah.
sometimes the Holy Spirit would move, and we would
Yeah.
just play for
Yeah.
3 hours, and we would leave there and be like, "Man, wasn't church so good?"
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, to find out that that was not the normal, or like that was a newer thing, and not
Yeah.
how I just thought that was church for my entire life. I was like, oh, this is church. I didn't even think about how they probably didn't have electronics back 2000
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
whatever. So yeah, to find the like structure of the liturgy, and which I love, by the way. Um, but to see that, and then to see that they were doing communion every week, and like having to change my idea of what worship is, and how it is a
Yes. Yes.
sacrifice, and how our whole mass is around communion, and to have to change my focus to that instead of the songs that I was playing, or the sermon that I was hearing, was really an interesting thing for me during my conversion.
Yeah, let's dig in there because especially like so from one charismatic Christian to another, like I hear you, like the altar calls, yes, the 3 hour worship band playing. Now you're playing in that band, so that's a whole
Mhm.
different kettle of worms. Like that worship thing, right? Like, as we would now this is probably so wacky for me, maybe a cradle Catholic listener, but our idea of worship, right, was the kind of the songs you're singing before and after the sermon, right?
Mhm.
Or like that raising our voices in praise, like giving God his due, like his honor, right?
Right.
Uh, there was in that altar call a call to conversion, a call to some kind of sacrifice. Often, like for us, it was like, what are you holding back from God, or what's holding you back from being closer to God? So there was an element of sacrifice in those altar calls, right? You want to come back to God and make sure you're ready, and these kinds of things. But that's what we called worship, right? And I know
Mhm.
for me, I read a little book, like a little thin, like 100-page book on by some lovely priest. I don't even know who it was. I got it in the mail from Knights of Columbus, this little booklet that I ordered online a very long time ago, so very early on in my journey. There's a thin little booklet that talked about what the Eucharist was, and I encountered in that little booklet this idea of worship being a sacrifice, and I was like,
Mhm.
what? Like that was it was right. That's so foreign to what we talk about when we mean worship, or we know, like the idea of a worship band. Like that seems like like a sacrifice band. That seems like a strange
Right.
idea, right? But that's what we thought
Mhm.
was worship, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, to think back and how, yeah, we did view that as worship. Um, and now compared to like what I believe obviously about the Eucharist, I look at like how surface level that is,
Yeah,
and how like I'm an imperfect person on this platform, and like, I can only do so much. And yeah, we can sing these songs and we can jump around, and whatever, but like, what does that do? Like, I just, now I like I don't know how I ever viewed it as worship, but it's because I didn't know like what true worship is. And I read Dr. Brant Petry's books, Jesus and the
Yeah, so
Jewish Roots of the
good, so
Eucharist.
good.
And it was like so mind blowing to me. And just like learning how there's a reason that we have the Eucharist, and it's because of the Old Testament, of the sacrifice there, and this is what made sense for the writers, or who they were intending it at the time. And for me, that made like everything click, and I was like, oh my gosh, like nothing that I could give is ever going to be, as good as the sacrifice that we have every day that Jesus has given us.
Yeah.
And so, yes, like worship music or praise music, whatever, can be great. However, like true undefiled worship is the sacrifice of Jesus in the Eucharist.
Yeah, yes, and that's the thing. That's the kicker, right? Like the worship music is great, it's fantastic. It's getting so close to that, but like in Dr. Petry's book, right? You begin to understand that worship for God in the history of salvation has always meant some kind of a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing to be praising God for, right, with our voices and singing, and that's great. I love the dancing, love that we had flags sometimes, which is the
Yeah,
height of like
we did
charismatic
too.
Christianity.
Yep.
It's great. Love to wave those flags. But right, there's that, what's missing is that element, and this is true for the altar call too, right? We called it an altar call, which is so
I know.
confusing because the altar like denotes a kind of sacrifice, right?
Right.
And
That's very true.
so when you begin to read in Catholic theology, you realize, you come full circle and realize that, okay, so, and this really peaked for me when I brought some evangelical friends to Mass for the first time. You realize how much of the language is language of sacrifice in the Mass. It's the priest representing Jesus to the Father, right? The Jesus on the cross to the Father, on the altar to the Father, right? It's this language of like, this is the sacrifice, like maybe pleasing to you. This is like, we're bringing this, like all we're doing in the Mass is that priest, like right in the person of Christ, is showing Christ back to the Father. And it's beautiful if you understand that, but it sounds really crazy if you don't.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that sacrifice language, but like that's what was missing from that altar call, right? In the evangelical church was this element of sacrifice. We were so close with this stuff, but right, just missing that last thing. And that was how God always worked, right? Was a sacrifice is part of worship, right? So that was like, I don't know, that was mind blowing to realize that we were missing that element, but it was there all along. Like that's how God always operated, right?
Yeah, definitely. And even just like, it's funny because our altar calls, I mean, the altar was like the steps for us,
the
like leading up
steps,
to the platform.
yes.
And so one day when I was in my Catholic parish, I said something about like, oh, so and so's on the altar, because they were like sitting on the steps, and they were like, what? Like, where's the, like, what do you mean? Because it took me a while to like understand the difference. And for me, I don't know, I would come to the altar in those charismatic church services, and I would feel like I had to like give everything up, and I was like, oh, I need to get better at this. And honestly, not to like switch topics here, but like that's why I also love the mercy of confession. And just like knowing that like Jesus is the perfect sacrifice in the Eucharist, but I also have confession to go to whenever I mess up and need that, instead of when I was in my evangelical church, I felt like I had to like come and like apologize for my sins like all these times, because I was never sure if I was really forgiven, and if I was forgiven and I messed up again, like it, for me, I was like way more scrupulous when I was an evangelical than I am as a Catholic, because of the grace of confession and having the Eucharist.
Yes, that's a great point. Jimmy Akin recently did a very tongue-in-cheek response to something that Dr. Gavin Rutland said about confession and this idea of forgiveness. I think it was so good, so maybe I'll link to it in the show notes. But it's the idea that, when do you feel more forgiven, right? And you're totally right. Like I was certainly way more scrupulous as an evangelical, because you would hear those altar calls like, if you don't, do you feel saved? If you died today, would you know where you're going? Would you, right? That was reinforced in the brand of Pentecostal Christianity that I was a part of, certainly. And so it was that constantly renewing your kind of commitment and promise, and constantly, right, asking to be resaved over and over again, because you weren't sure, right? And then here is this, like you say, there's a surety that comes from confession, comes from knowing, this theology says, if the priest has been empowered by Christ to say these words to forgive you, and you're forgiven, right? That is, like, I think, probably the number one thing we could, quote unquote, sell as like converts to other like people who are looking into the church. That is such a different experience in sacramental confession to like those altar calls, or that ability to feel forgiven as an evangelical, right? It's a drastically different process or feeling, right?
Yeah, I mean, everybody that I've ever talked to that's ever gone to confession has said, like, you feel like you feel the weight lifted off more than I ever felt anything in my charismatic churches. It's a beautiful thing, and people can say, whatever they want, but even like, if you're like, well, why don't you confess your sins directly to God? Like, of course we are. But also, like, even at the end, you say your little act of contrition and you're talking directly to God. So we got it covered. But it was something that I was really nervous about, which I think most people are, like, especially when you have to make your first confession of your entire life if you've been baptized. And I was baptized in college, and I was conditionally baptized, but I still made a confession for, all those years, almost 10 years.
Yeah.
And it was so like terrifying to me. But I went, and, I had a great priest who I'm sure has heard everything that I've ever said before. And so it wasn't like I was shocking him. And ever since then, like, yes, I still get nervous, but like, it's such a beautiful thing to like go. And also it makes me more mindful. I think someone had said, not to me, but about me when I had converted, that I just wanted to sin and do whatever I wanted and have a man forgive me. And I'm like, that's completely the opposite, because sometimes I will be going about my life and I'll want to get really angry at someone who's driving terribly next to me. And I'm like, I better be nice, because I'm going to have to confess that. And that's just like one example, but like there are other little things that come up that like it makes me think now that I have to be more mindful of my sins, and like, basically like keeping track of where I'm missing the mark, that it has made me pay more attention. And so, no, I would argue that was not what happened, but it has been a beautiful reshaping of my life and how I look at sin and how I approach God for mercy.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And you realize that when you're, I mean, maybe it's hard to, from the outside, understand this, but when you get into the sacramental reality of confession and the kind of the routine, the rhythm of living the Catholic life, you realize how sensible, like how much confession, reconciliation, the Eucharist, the rhythm of the sacraments makes sense, right? Like you're talking about the idea, this kind of deterrence effect of confession, because if I sin, I have to go, actually admit these sins, right? That doesn't exist as a same mechanism in the evangelical church. You sin, you privately ask God for forgiveness. I was talking to a family member recently, a relation of a relation. It's not terribly close, and he was coming hard at some of these Catholic ideas, and I love it. I'm there for it. Like, let's do this. But his hang up was confession. He said, "Well, why do you have to confess to a priest? Why can't you just confess to to your brother and ask for forgiveness for these things if you wrong them?" I said, well, you do that too, right? If you go punch out a guy, you should say sorry and then go to confession, right? You shouldn't just, right? But his hang up was, well, I just go to a man and I'm forgiven each time, and I can just keep doing it again and again and again. I'm like, no. Like you just said now, Taylor, that's not the reality of that. Like, sure, you could do that. You could live the life as a very contradictory, confusing Catholic with a weird kind of faith where you're going in and punching a guy once a week and going to confession and being forgiven and then going in and doing it again, right? I think first of all, the reply and my reply was, well, that's not true contrition of you. You just plan to go and do it again. Like you're not
Right.
actually asking God to forgive you.
Right.
You're just going to a guy in a box and saying this, and then going and doing that again. But the reality of the Catholic life is as you described, right? That the idea of knowing that I'm actually accountable for my sins in a real way,
Mhm.
like to Jesus in this mechanism that he's established where I have to actually go to this thing and like actually seek forgiveness in a real tangible way. Like that has a huge impact on your faith life to help you to avoid those things. And you realize right in that, and also in the idea that you're hearing somebody say you are forgiven, like the power of that sacrament, when you get into it and start to live that life, you realize how that makes so much sense, and so much
Mhm.
more sense than how I used to do it as an evangelical, which is just kind of pray in my room by myself and try and feel forgiven. If I didn't, go to the altar call
Right.
that Sunday or that Wednesday night, right, at Bible study or worship, family worship night, whatever it might be called, right? The sacramental idea of reconciliation made so much and makes so much more sense,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Also, because it's really something else that I didn't expect about the church is how lovely it is to trust her. And so, the church
Yes.
teaches us that once we are forgiven, like all of our sins are forgiven from that point. And so you're basically, once you leave the confessional, you're starting clean. Like your sins are gone. You don't have to think about, oh, was I forgiven? I don't know. Like if you hear that words of absolution, like, yes, like you are
Yeah.
forgiven of those sins. And so, for me, also like another thing I had to learn, unlearn, whatever, is to like really trust in like God's forgiveness. Because before, kind of like what you were saying, I would question if I was really forgiven or if I was really sorry enough, especially if I messed up again and did the same thing. And so, confession again for me, I can leave that confessional and like know that I'm forgiven. And like if I mess up again, yes, I'm going to bring it back to confession, but I don't have to be like, was I really forgiven last week when I confessed this? Like, yes. Which is so lovely.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You talked about encountering kind of the early church and this
Mhm.
kind of. I can remember on my journey, and now I was pretty close with, for a time, the pastor of our non-denominational evangelical kind of charismatically flavored church for a while, and he knew a bit about my story, aspects of it. I came to him with some questions that I had along the way. He tried, didn't get great answers, but then he began to, I noticed, kind of incorporate like early church fathers into his sermons. So like there'd be a lot of
Hmm.
quotes, and suddenly a quote from like Jerome would pop up, or a quote from Augustine would pop up, and I'm like, oh, and I was clearly like, I feel like he was trying to cater a bit to like, people like me on these kind of journeys. There's an aspect where you approach. Maybe is true for you. There's an aspect where you approach the early church thinking, okay, they might say things that maybe sound kind of Catholic, but these guys fit fine in my evangelical church. There's ways I can incorporate what I'm reading into my evangelical kind of faith. And I think for many of us, there's a point we get to where you realize that the more you read, say, the early church, you realize that, wait a minute, like on balance, this is the Catholic Church I'm encountering in the early church, and there comes a point where you have a hard time shoehorning the early church fathers or like Christian history into an evangelical context. Did you experience that when you were kind of encountering these ideas, or was there a place where you're like, I can remain like evangelical to a point, and maybe a tipping point where you're like, yeah, this is like maybe gone a bit too far, and
Yeah.
I can't fit this in my theology anymore. Does that make
Uh,
sense?
yeah. No, the answer for me was no when it came to trying to apply the early church fathers to evangelicalism. But I think that's because I mostly read Irenaeus on the Eucharist really early
He was
on.
done. Yeah,
And so,
yeah.
like, after that, I was like, I can't read these guys. Like, they're not going to help me. Um, but I did search out, like, other types of answers, not necessarily like just church fathers, but like what the early church, I guess, believed on certain things, hoping that it would give me some
Yeah,
like
yeah,
peace.
yeah.
But really, Irenaeus did it for me. I was pretty much done after that. Like I said, still tried everything in my power.
Yeah.
But I knew like once I was like going to get back into church, I knew if I was going to stay Christian, I was going to have to either be Catholic or Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah.
For me, once I started reading the church fathers after leaving evangelicalism, I knew that there was like no other way for me to go if I was going to be honest with what I believed and what they believed. There was also like evidence of asking for Mary's intercession pretty early on in the church. And so that also was like another thing that guided me towards accepting that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious. I mean, and this is a double-edged sword because the Catholic Church isn't necessarily much better when it comes to leadership sometimes. There's obviously scandals that abound in the Catholic Church. It's different, I think, though, than, like, certainly for me, a non-denominational evangelical kind of charismatic church, right, has no real accountability to anybody but people in that building kind of thing, right? There's denominations, of course, for different churches. Maybe this is your experience, but there's a bit more accountability. But you mentioned before the idea of this church leadership, and you kind of saw decisions were being made that kind of made you feel a bit more jaded or like, or concerned. I'm curious how you kind of fit that into, because you said you encountered apostolic succession and realized, wait a minute, there's a whole thing here. I think for so many listeners and viewers, this show, people on the journey, that is not even anywhere on our radar, right? As like an evangelical, the apostles lived, they died, like, and churches continued, like they had no connection to, like, no successors or no like sense of like the bishops being established, right? In my understanding of church history. Of course, you read the Bible with a different perspective or fresh eyes, and you see clear evidence of like bishops and succession, and these things are obviously in there. Somehow we missed all of those, right? But how did you come to understand the importance of that? I think maybe too in light of like your encounters with leadership in like the local church level. Like, was that a thing you were like, oh, I see a different way of doing this here?
Yeah, sure. My personal experience in the last evangelical church that I was a part of, I struggled. There were some certain things from leadership there, but at the end of the day, they were the leaders, you know?
Yeah.
Non-denominational also can equal non-accountable,
Yeah.
with nobody to go to. They called the shots, and there was nowhere else to go. And that was hard for me. And so understanding that there should probably be somebody that these people who are over these people are reporting to, started to kind of make sense as I started to read scripture, especially, when Jesus tells Peter, like, upon this rock I'll build my church. And it's funny, I have all of my Protestant Bibles still. I probably have 14 Bibles.
That's right.
And I would read my Fire Bible, which is a study Bible with Assemblies of God commentary.
Yeah.
And I remember like reading those commentary to be like, oh, what's this say about this? And it was like, understand that this is not about Peter, but it's about like his profession of faith. But then as I started reading more, I was like, well, that doesn't make sense because, there had to be somebody continuing on the church. It's not just going to be like, all right, good luck, everybody.
Yeah.
Because that's how we have so many Protestant denominations is like people decide what they want to believe about certain verses. And, when I would bring up certain like theological questions or differences, I was never met with like grace. I was met with like, this is what it says.
Yeah.
But it was like a new interpretation and like, who's right. And so that was the big thing for me. It was like, somebody has to be right on this. Like, it's either true or it's not. It's either a symbol or it's real presence. We can't both be right here. Of course, we could say that it's also symbolic, but you know what I'm saying here.
Yeah.
And so for me, once I really discovered like it came down to the authority of the church and interpretation of scripture, for me, it was like, yeah, it makes sense that there's like a hierarchy here. People are accountable to other people because that's how, the church continues on.
Yeah. That's a great way of putting it and a great context to put it in, right? For me, we had big questions in our non-denominational church, and like for you, like there's no accountability beyond the leadership structure of that church, right? And of course, we began to ask big questions about marriage and family and gender and these things, and the leadership of that church was divided. The church eventually, after we left, split apart on these very same questions, right? But there was that's kind of the very one of those kind of things that like years and years ago led me on this journey, kind of asking the question, well, who's right on this interpretation? Like, who of us, like, reading the same Bible, like, looking at how come this commentary says this about like that, and this commentary says this, and they don't match, right? And when I and this is probably similar for you, Taylor, when I encountered the idea of the magisterium and of a church that, or authority that Christ gave to his apostles to pass on to interpret like what he meant about things, right? And was written in scripture, that was like just sensible. Like it just made logical sense of like the whole mess that I was seeing in like my non-denominational church. I thought, well, here. And I remember bringing that to my pastor that I mentioned before and saying, well, how do we? This makes sense. Like, how do we make sense of this? And I think he tried his best, but I had no real good answer to that I received. Because there wasn't. Like, you can read however hard you want and get the commentaries you want and pray as hard as you can and come to different conclusions. Like, two really honest, earnest people, it didn't make sense. And then along comes the idea of the magisterium, apostolic succession, the authority that Christ gave his church. That was just so much more sensible, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Something that I was thinking about a couple weeks ago was anytime that I would want to attend a new church, I would have to go to the What We Believe section.
Yes.
And I would have to see if enough of what they believe lined up with what I believed, because most of the time, there's one or two things that I had different ideas on. And it's, I think, honestly, like, unfortunate that we have so much disunity in Protestantism, especially because like Christ established one church and there's one truth. And for me, like I said, I love magisterium. I love being able to submit to the church. I love when I get questions in my live streams and it's like, what do you believe about this? And I'm like, well, the Catholic Church teaches this. So that's what I believe. And they'll be like, well, we want to hear your thoughts. And I'm like, those are my thoughts. Like, submitting to the church has been the greatest gift of my life.
Preach it.
It's beautiful. And it's also, I love being able to trust, again, the church that's been around for thousands of years versus someone who just decided to start a church 5-10 years ago because of some, beliefs that they differed on. For me, it's a no-brainer now to just be like, yeah, I trust the Catholic Church because they've been here. They've been there since the beginning. But I don't know. It took me a while to get there to like love being able to just submit to the Catholic Church, because for a while I was like, no, this is what I believe. Like, this is what I've been taught. Converting to Catholicism has basically just been like 6 years of trying to be humbled by the Lord.
That's a good word. And I want to say, like, I'll close things down. I won't keep you the entire night, although I could. This is a fantastic conversation. Thank you. But what you said is so profound, the idea of submitting to the church, right? And you mentioned before the aspect of faith being important, right? You have to, there is an element of faith required here in believing that this is the church that Christ established. He meant it when he said, this is on this rock. That has continued, right? That Christ would give us a church. He wants a church, John 17, that's united like him and the Father are, right? There's an element of faith that is required to believe that this is the church. But you believe that, right? Believe and submit, right? You believe that, and you can submit to this. Like, it is such a different way of living to be able to say, you know what? Yeah. You know what? All the different things that are out there that we wrestle with in Scripture, you can do that, and we can still do that. And there's theologians that's an okay thing to do. But at the end of the day, you can say, well, the church believes this. The church in the authority that Christ gave the apostles, the bishops have, the church has worked this out, and this is what the church believes, and that's what I believe too. Like, that is such a different experience than coming from like a non-denominational background where we're working out different things. And like you said, you're looking at belief statements on church websites, right? To try and figure this out, and you're agreeing, disagreeing. It is such a different, much more healthy, much more freeing, like much more holy, life-giving to like repent, believe, and submit, right?
Yes. Yeah, I also think too, the idea that the focus of the Mass is the Eucharist every
Yeah.
week. And
Yeah.
so we believe in that as Catholics. And so that always is what unites us. When you are in a non-denominational church, what you're there for is the sermon. And so that, depending on how they interpret the scripture that they're preaching about, that's what you're focused on, is that Bible teaching, whatever, like I said, their interpretation is.
Yeah.
But for us, that's not the case. Like, we're focused on what we believe is true worship of Jesus in the Eucharist. And yes, we can question the other things, but at the end of the day, like, we believe that the Eucharist is true. And so that's what really matters. And so it's kind of nice to not have to ask all those questions and worry about that when we can come back to be united in communion.
That's a good word. That's a very good word. I love that. This has been an awesome conversation, Taylor. Thank you. I want to give you a chance to tell people where they can find and follow you. I'm going to put links in the show notes because I mentioned before at the top, it's awesome content. I love it. So what do you want to tell them? Where can they go to find and follow your stuff? What do you want to?
Yeah, so just to speak to that a little bit, I started sharing my faith journey when I had nobody to talk to about it. So
I love it.
I blocked every single person that I knew on TikTok, and I just started talking to a camera. And I still do that. But so now on TikTok and Instagram, I'm under Gemma in the Rough. Gemma is my confirmation saint. And basically the name is just like diamond in the rough. Like, I'm being formed. I'm not perfect, never will be. But it just is me sharing my life. And like I said, I love the church so much. It's the greatest gift I've ever been given. And so I just enjoy sharing it. Even though my conversion, that story has been told, I'm still sharing just what I'm learning and what my life looks like as a Catholic in full communion with the church.
That's fantastic. I love it. It's great. It's fantastic content. So thank you. Listen, I want to say thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for the work you're doing for the church. God bless you in that content and that journey. It's awesome. And thank you. This has been fun. I'm really happy to have had this chance. It's great to just get down in the weeds with a fellow charismatic Christian. So it's always fun. Altar call at the end.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, Taylor. God bless you, the work you're doing for the church, and thank you so much for being here.
Yep. Thank you.